Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to find out a little bit more about George Harrison by looking at his book, I, Me, Mine. It was published in 1980, and this is the book that George wrote telling details about his life and the meanings of his songs. There aren't that many pages regarding his life, but enough to let us see what George was like. So this was a book that upset John Lennon because he felt he should have been given more than one line regarding his influence on George Harrison. He felt George gave every two-bit musician more time than he gave him. Well, let us look at the book and see what we can find. First off, I love the dedication. It said, "This book is dedicated to gardeners everywhere, G.H." This shows right there that gardening was his place to find peace and tranquility. He sure picked a property large enough to plant all the flowers in the world in. A friend writes about George to start out the book. Derek Taylor went to a Beatles concert with his girlfriend and later was asked at his job to do a column. And in that column, he would be writing as George, and then he would show George Harrison what he'd written when he completed the work. So George and Derek became good friends, and he stated that George was not a quiet Beatle, but a very talkative man. But he had an interest in expressing himself. So next, the book goes into the words of George Harrison, and George started by writing about visiting a place where he grew up with his wife Olivia. The place was called Arnold Grove, unadopted, and it still was named that when he visited. He said there was no garden, and you entered the home from the street. And entering the house, you were in the front room, and then there was a back room which led to stairs where there were 2 bedrooms. And they were on the housing list for 25 years before they were able to move to a better location. And he said there was a little iron stove in the kitchen in the back room, and that was the kitchen, they called it, and the oven was alongside the fire. It's like there was an open fireplace, and that's where the heat came from. So George said each room downstairs was 10 feet square, very small. In the winter it was cold in the house, and there was no central heating, and there was only that one fire in one room. And when you went to bed, you had a hot water bottle. In the backyard, it was all paved except for a 1-foot wide flower bed. And then they had an outdoor toilet, and one time they had a hen house. So George said that the house was okay, and it was pleasant being a small home, and it was sunny in the summer. And he probably loved the house mainly because of his siblings and his parents, because he came from a very loving family, and usually it doesn't matter where you're living as long as you're together with people that you really love. So I think that's what did it for him. But I could see now why he loved Friar Park so much, the place he ended up living in. It was everything he never had as a child and young man. So next up, George discussed school and how he hated it. And he said that the school was the worst time of his life. It was all about sports, and that didn't interest him. And he said he got caned at school by one of the teachers. The cane hit him in the wrist. George didn't want his dad to see it, but his dad did see it, and he went to school, and the teacher was called out of the classroom, and George's father hit him. Later, Paul McCartney did an interview where he thought it was really great that George's dad, went to the school and hit the teacher because he was taking up for George. The next, George went to the institute called the Liverpool Institute, and he felt the teachers there were either war veterans or just out of college. George felt they didn't know much, and they weren't very helpful. And George stated that the testimonial to get him a job for the rest of his life said, "I cannot tell you what his work is like because he has not done any." So that wasn't very helpful for getting George into a career. George and his love of music. When George was growing up, there was music in his house. An early memory George had was when he was a baby, he stood on a little leather stool and sang One Meatball. He also remembered hearing the song Hong Kong Blues when he was 4 years old. George recalled going with his parents when he was a baby, and they would go to different places and dance at the club or go see neighbors. Now we get to the part when George is out of school and needing a job. Well, George never had any money, and he used to borrow money from his dad, which he felt bad about. And one day his dad said to him, "Hadn't you better get a job or something?" So George was playing in a band but not making much money, and he finally got a job as an apprentice electrician. And there he used a paintbrush to clean all the lights. So George was in the Beatles at this time and just beginning to get work. He went to his boss when the Beatles got their first gig in Scotland, and he said to his boss, "I'm leaving, I'm sorry." He said it felt great to say it. He was only 17 years old, and he said, "I resign." He felt they got their money's worth out of him. He was making 30 bobs a week, which is £1 50, or in American money about $1.71. So George had to move out of town. After the Beatles became famous, George and the Beatles were always mobbed by fans. George and Patty, his girlfriend at the time, moved to Esher and in a house on the Claremont estate. It was like living in London, but it was outside the city and it had a wall around it. Later he was to move to his beloved Friar Park. George said if his manager Brian had been alive, he probably wouldn't have gotten the place because it was going beyond his means. But the Beatles manager Alan Klein wanted them to be happy, so he encouraged George to get it. George said he was glad he did it, and it enhanced his life greatly. According to Wikipedia, Friar Park is in a Victorian neo-Gothic mansion in Henley-on-the-Thames, England, built in 1889. It was originally owned by an eccentric lawyer, Sir Frank Crisp, and purchased in January 1970 by George Harrison. And the site covers 62 acres. Can you imagine that? What a lot of land. And it features caves, grottos, underground passages, and a multitude of garden gnomes, and an alpine rock garden with a scale model of the Matterhorn. Olivia Harrison, George's wife, said there are 30 rooms at the house. The Friar Park estate was owned by Sir Frank Crisp from 1889 until his death in 1919. The property was then sold at an auction to Sir Percival David. Following their divorce, Lady David moved into the coachman's cottage on the southwest corner of the property when the rest of the estate was donated for the use of nuns. The nuns ran a local school in Henley, the Sacred Heart School, but by the late 1960s, Friar Park was in a state of disrepair and due to be demolished. Luckily, George Harrison came along, and he loved the place, and he bought it. And he got his love of gardening, he said, in his young days because his dad had a garden 10 feet by 10 feet at the front, and there was a bigger garden out back, and George's dad grew everything there. So that was at the second place they had moved to. And George remembered digging and getting his fingers in the soil, and so George got his hobby early in life. George Harrison said that rock and roll musicians on the road are looking at other rock and roll bands and listening to the radio. George got his inspiration at Friar Park, where the mood is so different from anywhere else because of the peace. I imagine it must have been heavenly to live out there with nature all around. But this is odd. George loved motor racing too. It's funny that George was a gardener out in the peace and quiet, but he also loved motor racing, which was loud and fast. And George said he couldn't remember why he got into it. But when he was growing up, he was into motorbikes, and his hero was Jeff Duke, and he also liked watching Grand Prix racing. George also remembered the early days of BRM, British Racing Motor, and he said it was a patriotic thing. When George got older, he was more into guitars, but still keeping up with the sport in the 60s and beyond. George later would see the races at Monte Carlo. And then one day in 1978, George was able to take a few laps in the then contemporary F1 car. He did 4 or 5 laps. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, and I bet George loved it. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point in the book. In the next video, I'll discuss George and his thoughts on songs he wrote that should be interesting to find out. I think George growing up in the environment he did made him want more from life, and it's amazing how famous he became doing the things he loved. So I hope everyone liked the video. And if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would help the channel. And also, if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you do that, then it'll let you know when new videos are coming out. So I hope everybody's been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.